your 2 minutes well, because we're going to get started here in just a moment. Firstly, I've got some handouts. I apologize, but I neglected. I usually run extra copies before class, and I forgot to. So I've got about 10 handouts, so we're going to have to do a few per table. Can I recruit somebody to stick a few per table? Roberto, thank you so much. I'll hold on to one for me. All right. Oh, wait. Here you go, Roberto. I have one. Thank you. All right, so while the handouts are coming around, we're coming to our final session of Martin Luther on mental health. That's this text right here. I hope several of you are very familiar with how this looks because you've had a chance to read and work through this. My thanks to all the elders who have helped over the course of the entire summer and now into the, do we call this fall? Is this fall yet? Yeah, it's, I think, yeah, the school buses say yes, the Equinox says no. So we'll see which one you go with, but as we have lapped into September a little bit. So today, no, wait a second. We still together, yeah, that's right, crowd. Yep. All right. So today we're finishing up. We're going to be going over chapters 9 and chapter 10, and helping out today is one of our newest elder, Jason Miller, is going to be helping us out. This was fortuitous because Bud Williams was going to help and then ended up not being able to, and Jason was ready to pinch it. So very much appreciate that. So I'm going to start us out with a word of prayer. This is now going to be focusing on the very practical steps of how do we try to help. We've spent a lot of time over the course of the summer, and I know with summer you're in and you're out, but talking about what is a mental health problem? How do we know what we're even talking about? What are some of the ways that we go about? We've got handouts coming around to the tables, so hopefully we'll have a few per table. What's that? Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be great. Yeah, if somebody doesn't mind. The handouts are on the tables. And Donna's running to make some more. So more handouts on the way. And then what are some of the ways that help cognitively? Like how do we think about these things? What are some of the behaviors we can do that can help to influence these things? We had a couple weeks off for picnics and so forth, and now we're bringing it to a close. So let me open us up with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive in. The Lord be with you. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together, having spent time in your word and around your gifts, strengthened and renewed by those once again, as we're aware of the incredible prevalence of mental health challenges that are faced by ourselves, by our loved ones, the people around us that we interact with every day. Thank you for the ability to become more aware of what those challenges are and how to start to approach them. Today we talk more about how we can try to support those whom we love who are facing them themselves. So I pray that you would guide our conversations and our reflections together around your word and toward this specific challenge. Thank you for Jason's willingness to help to lead. Bless our time, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.
All right. Here we go. Active participation is required. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so these are really interesting chapters. Hopefully everybody got a chance to read through them. If you didn't, that's okay too. I think it's going to generate some good discussion. I'll read the first two, and then I'm going to ask for some readers as we get into some of these sections that are going to generate a little bit more discussion. So, applying Luther's advice, strategies for helping someone in emotional distress change his or her thinking or behavior were reviewed in chapters 7 and 8. These strategies can be implemented within the context of helpful conversations. So how does a helpful conversation start? Can anyone volunteer to read in that block there under the how do helpful conversations start? Rob, thanks, sir.
A person distressed by a mental health problem will most likely come directly to you, seeking assistance and consolation. The only preparation necessary for these conversations is not being surprised that the person is coming to you is experiencing mental health problems. There will be times when you will be obliged to approach someone about mental health concerns.
So any thoughts on this? You know, what Luther's talking about here, if someone comes to you and has something that they want to address, you know, what do you think he's trying to say here? If someone comes to you with an issue, how we should respond?
Is this addressed more to pastors?
So that's part of the thing with these chapters is I have a feeling that Saunders, the author, developed this maybe for pastors' conferences and then adapted it into a book.
Yeah.
So there are a few times, like I don't know. I mean, I do think there's still the very high likelihood that in our own relationship, someone might come to you and say, yeah, I've been dealing with such and such. That quote especially does seem geared a little more toward assuming a pastor audience or readership. But I still think it's true, you know, his main point that either people will come to you or you're going to go to them. I mean, those are kind of the two ways that can start.
And I think the biggest thing for me was not to react surprised, right? So if you come off like, oh wow, I wouldn't expect that to happen to you, or oh, that's strange that you're feeling that way, that would put somebody on guard right away. And we're going to talk today about, especially I think the most impactful section is about empathy and active listening and setting the stage for a helpful conversation. Brian?
I think that one time I took a coaching course, and they, one of the biggest things was anytime anybody expresses an emotion to you, happiness, sadness, frustration, joy, pain, that's an opening. And basically they're inviting you to make a connection with them. So anytime, and you talk about empathy, anytime anyone expresses emotion to you, that's an opening for you to make some sort of connection with them. And, you know, in the context of, you know, the scriptures, that's also an opportunity for you to show your Christian love and in a variety of different ways to perhaps attract them to Christ because of how you respond.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, you know, first impressions are a big thing, right? If we're meeting somebody for the first time, or if we are just engaging someone in conversation, if someone's coming to us, you know, we want to make sure as Christians that we set the stage that, you know, we're going to try to listen and have a helpful conversation.
Sometimes I feel like people are coming to you because they want to just vent, they just want to kind of pour off and like unload, but they don't necessarily they don't really seek advice. So I think that's got to be something we got to be, like, well, I should be not concerned about, but just being like intuitive about, because don't want to just give advice if it's unsolicited. I just want to be an ear sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Luther talks about some of this in terms of, you know, just listening might be the most impactful thing that you can do for them, because maybe they don't have a trusted source to talk to. Maybe they don't have someone in their circle of influence that can have some of these difficult discussions. And he talks about this a little bit too when he talks about, you know, steadfastness and hesitant boldness, to sort of think about what you're going to say back to them. Is it just going to be listening? Are you going to offer advice? How do we want to offer that advice? And he's going to get into that a little bit today.
The extra handouts have arrived. If anybody's waiting for more, we've got Isaiah bringing them around. So stick a hand up if I'm good. We're good up here, buddy. Yeah, we're all set.
Handout
I
or
had a feeling
comment?
that, yeah.
Okay.
All right, take them around. Anybody's
Okay.
got a hand up, Isaiah.
So goals of a helpful conversation. Can somebody read this for us?
We're gonna have lots of volunteers because they're waiting for
Are
handouts.
these reading? Oh, these are 3 people that want to read.
Yeah. But don't have a handout that can read us, so.
All right, all the reading hands went down. Any reading hands?
All right,
Okay.
Brenda.
All right, thank you.
A helpful conversation does not solve someone's problems. That would be a wonderful thing to do, obviously, but it is very unlikely to be possible. A helpful conversation is helpful when it addresses with compassion and kindness what the person is experiencing. Some things are fairly safe to assume the person is experiencing. First, the person is distraught. Second, the person is confused. Third, the person is anxious about talking to you. The goals of a helpful conversation follow from this. When you listen with kindness and express understanding of the distress, you can alleviate her confusion and her shame. By expressing understanding, you signal that the distress is okay. By expressing understanding, you communicate that she is understandable, not confusing. This sounds like a large task, but it is not. The task is mostly, if not completely, accomplished by the simple kindness of meeting, listening, and offering comfort and consolation.
Thank you. So this is kind of what we were just talking about in terms of listening. And one of the notes that I took here was, if you think about going into these conversations, having the perspective of just listening to start, it'll kind of take the pressure off both of you, right? If I'm the one helping, it might take the pressure off of me that I don't have to have the solution right away, and that's okay. Maybe I just have to be the listener to start, as you mentioned, and then maybe the solutions could come from that. But any other thoughts on this section?
I'll share. What I like about this is, obviously our goal is not that by the end of today we finish and we're all licensed clinical social workers, right? That's not the intent. Nor would that be even a noble goal, because A, it's not gonna be everybody's vocation anyway. And there is a danger of thinking, I can solve this, I can serve in the role that a counselor would serve for this person. So it's just having a helpful conversation with them. And so I love that idea that doesn't have to be geared toward a particular outcome. Echoing Katya, a little later, we're gonna get the section of the things to avoid, what would derail, and one of those is, jumping right to advice or trying to solve or whatever. But a willingness to listen. Call on your wife there. Yeah. I won't do it for you. Yeah.
Lindsay?
I'm looking at this as a parent, and a parent of someone who actually suffers from mental health. I have a child with severe anxiety, and there are times when that becomes overwhelming, but I have to train myself to be an active listener, and sometimes situations are overwhelming for me as well, but learning to listen and not always jump to having a resolution even as a mom when you want to, and offering that comfort, and sometimes just listening and offering comfort aids in that anxiety and that heightened emotion that my child is experiencing, and that in itself can sometimes fix the problem that she's facing. So that's helpful in our situations now, not always, because anxiety is a large emotion, but it's something that is helpful in our conversations at times. So I don't know, mental health is, I think everyone in this room is probably affected in some way, but if that's helpful as a parent, I thought I'd offer that piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's what Luther was talking about when he was saying, listen with kindness and express understanding. And if you have that as the foundation, you can kind of see where things go from there. And a little bit later in this section, we will talk about kind of how to help the families that are taking care of someone that has a mental health issue as well, and some of the support that we can provide to them too. Any other thoughts on goals of a helpful conversation before we go to the next section?
Jason, I think along the lines of what Lucy was saying, I think sometimes, for me, I'm a problem solver, and somebody, has a conversation with me, and I want to try to help solve the problem, right? And sometimes people don't want you to solve the problem. They just want you to listen to what they have to say and be empathetic about it. And, I understand that's frustrating, or, I can understand how that would, make them feel. People don't always want you to fix their problems. Sometimes they want somebody to just listen to them and be empathetic. And you can be empathetic without necessarily agreeing with them, agreeing with their position. You can be empathetic by understanding their emotions, their frustrations, or that type of thing. I think that's really what being an active listener is all about. It isn't always about solving the problem.
Yeah, thank you.
There was a joke going around on the internet a while ago. This kid texts another kid, "My burrito fell apart." And the other one replies, "Oh no, are you in your feelings about it, or are you solutions oriented?" That's actually come in very handy dealing with friends.
Yeah.
You don't want to offend, but it's good to ask.
Yeah.
That's great. That's funny.
I think Christy has a hand up too.
I like the ability. That's really fun. Listen with kindness and express understanding of her distress. Because if you stop with just express understanding, that can be, there are a lot of situations with people that you're dealing with, and you've never been in their situation. So there's a humility in saying, I understand that you're distressed, but I know that there's no way I can't feel what you're feeling. I've never been in this. I can't really understand your situation, but I can understand the feeling and validate that. So if there's a
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. All right, so let's move to the next section here, talking about emulating Luther's manner. And the author, states that, emulating Luther is not always a great idea, but his manner of dealing with persons in emotional distress is worth copying. And in pages 120 to 122, he talks about three primary things: kindness, steadfastness, and hesitant boldness. And I have a few notes on these, but for those of you that read the book, any thoughts on any of these three? How Luther acted with kindness, steadfastness, or let's start with those two, and then we'll get to the hesitant boldness. Well, I can kind of kick it off a little bit. So, one of the things that Luther did, especially with, individuals that were sick, he wanted to sort of show that, there was a warmth to him and a love to him, and he would come in close to them and talk with them, as opposed to standing at a distance, trying to create some sort of, like a warm blanket. I'm not afraid. I want to be there for you. I want to learn about, what's going on with you, asking them questions, engaging in conversation. And he also let them know, and we've talked about this in some of previous chapters, that, hey, you're not the only one going through that, right? I thought I was the only one that was going through that. And now you have somebody else that's gone through and experienced the same things. And let's talk about that a little bit more. I'm happy to tell you how that affected me. I'd love to hear how that affected you. And then that can really sort of let the walls go down and maybe create an engaging conversation. So he didn't want them to feel isolated, that, hey, you're not the only person going through this. I've gone through this too. Here's what I've struggled with. Here's how I try to adapt it or apply biblical, words or principles or knowledge, God's word, to the situation. And here's some things that I can do for you as well. And then on the steadfastness, this kind of goes back to the Bible side of things, the Word of God, in the sense that, being anxious or feeling depressed, we shouldn't have to do those things. The passage and Pastor talked about it today. Sufficient for, today is, what you're worrying about. Don't worry about tomorrow. But it's okay. It's not a sin. This is part of being human nature. And there's a reason why God came. There's a reason why he became human flesh. There's a reason why he was crucified, died, buried, and resurrected, is he became man to go through the same things that you've gone through. And this is a place that you can turn and remind them of his sacrifice, his forgiveness, and the salvation that he provides as well. And that's where I think as Christians, regardless of whether you're, dealing with a brother in Christ or someone that doesn't know Christ, here's perhaps an example to share our faith in terms of an experience that we've had, how God helped us change our perspective on things or got us through something that, might create an ember through the Holy Spirit that way as well. Do you have any other?
Yeah, I'll jump into if at the end of the section about steadfastness, it brought up again the one we had a whole section on Anfechtung, the spiritual struggle that we go through. Was that you, Dan? Did you lead us on that one? That's what I thought, yeah. So that Luther basically invented a word for it, which is this, the emotional mental distress that we go through as part of our, not just life, but life of faith. And so this really does a nice job. We're going to get into this a little bit more, I think, but we also went into it previously of just helping to normalize, this, it's not to minimize how hard it is, but that what you're experiencing, people experience this. This is part of something. You're not alone, you're not weird. You might be, but this isn't evidence for it, right? So the fact of the matter is that these are things that people have dealt with, and I think it can be helpful, particularly if you're talking with someone who is also Lutheran Christian in their understanding, saying, the guy that our church is named after, he went through so much in terms of mental health struggle that he actually kind of invented a theological way of thinking about it. This struggle, this affection, this Anfechtung that he had to deal with. That's okay. That's part of life this side of heaven, And I love that Saunders, the author, points out, we can reassure that this is not a sin. Sometimes it is a sin, but then we reassure that's what Jesus came to die for. So, it's win-win, because if it's not a sin, you can say, listen, this is just, you're feeling feelings. God gave you those feelings. That's not sinful in and of itself. But even if it is something that were sinful, some sinful desire or disordered longing or something like that could, even by itself, could be considered potentially sinful. That's what Jesus came to die for. So I think that's especially the steadfastness part of we're not just, we're having helpful conversations, that's all we're trying to do. But we're also not just along for the ride wherever emotions or mental states are taking us. We do have a larger picture that we're a part of, and no matter what's happening day by day in our faith walk, that doesn't change what Christ did on the cross, doesn't change the fact that he's coming back, doesn't change what our eternity is going to be. So we can really dig in on whatever it is that we're dealing with now, knowing that it's just for now. And there's a larger framework of which this will not change one little bit. And that can be really, really reassuring, It's not necessarily all of this stuff, all of the practical stuff, I would say, be careful, it's like anybody who's familiar with using tools, you have to try to discern which tool it's time to use. Because if you grab the saw when it's time for the glue, you're gonna make the problem worse, not better, right? So, but recognizing there's a time for empathy, there's a time for reminding people of the larger picture of faith, there's a time for steadfastness, there's a time for just keeping your mouth shut, all of those. And it's kind of becoming familiar with tools and how they can help.
And kind of along those same lines, I think that sort of rolls right into what Luther was saying about hesitant boldness, which is basically, as Christians, we understand the Bible. We may be able to see as the listener maybe what's going on, but the hesitant boldness is to maybe not necessarily come out and say, oh, I know what's wrong. The purpose is to maybe help the person that is speaking to us what they're thinking about. Help them think about what they're thinking. Help them maybe process some of these things where maybe they can uncover, some of the solution of the problem. It's not necessarily us jumping right into it. It's, maybe sort of eloquently saying something that, here's maybe what's going on. What do you think about that? What do you think about this emotion that you're having? Why is this emotion happening? And we're going to talk about that in a few sections down the road here about helping someone to sort of frame, what's causing me to have this anxiety. Is it something that is passing that probably will go away? Or is it something that really needs to be addressed, possibly clinically? And we'll get into that in a little bit.
If it's okay, I want to share, you may have read it already, but an example of the way that Luther was writing to a prince, so obviously you got to be on your best behavior, even Luther. But he starts out by saying, if I'm mistaken in my judgment and have done your grace an injustice, I hope that your grace will be good enough to forgive me. But then offers, it's my opinion that your grace is reluctant to be married. That in the situation you can read, actually, I think I mentioned I do have the collection of letters if anybody at some point wants to borrow it and read it. It's fascinating, or you can get it on Amazon. Fascinating stuff. But this is the kind of idea of saying, well, I feel like this might be what I'm seeing, and if I'm wrong, that's, just let me know. That's fine, and I don't hope this doesn't seem belittling or anything like that, but this is what it seems like it might be. Does it feel like that could describe what you're describing to me? And that can be just a very helpful way, because then if they say, no, it's really not that at all, then great, you're moving your way toward a better understanding, and they're moving their way toward a better expression of what it is that they're going through. Or they could say, yeah, maybe it's kind of partly that, but I feel like it's more this. Or it could be, yeah, that's it exactly. That you just nailed it. That's exactly what I feel like I'm doing. But what you don't want to do is just say, you're depressed. Like, all right, well, if it's true, that's not helpful. If it's not true, that's not helpful. So probably better to say, well, from what I'm hearing, it seems like you may be dealing with a major depressive episode or something like that. You don't have to get it all clinical, but, just... The moment was coming as I was stacking cups. Yeah. Isaiah, how do you feel about that? What just happened?
It's funny.
I also have knocked cups over. I know what it.
Well, there's your answer.
There's my answer. Yeah. That's awesome.
So any other thoughts before we jump to this next section?
Jody. Yeah.
Just following up on what you said about steadfastness, it's just giving that space where someone feels comfortable talking to you, like when somebody, like I'm from Salt River too, and it's like, oh, there's a problem, let's fix it, you'll feel better, I'll feel better, we're gonna be better, we're better, and it's like, hey, let's do the next thing, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help, but just being that person, like, asking that question, like, are you feeling this way? And then just kind of creating that space where they can get just, like you were just saying, if your kids are upset and they're here in an emotional state,
Right.
you can tell them, don't worry, that shark on TV's not gonna be you're fine. But they're like, no, they're just like, you gotta calm them first, then you can
exactly.
Read, that's the first battle, get rid of anxiety, and it's a great time to have conversations. Just sometimes being quiet helps so much.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. That actually sort of takes us into this next section, which I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on these next two sessions, because I think these are things that we kind of know as we can jump to the active listening and the empathy. But the next two sections are really about practical considerations and nonverbal communication. So you can see here, a helpful conversation should happen in private. Conversation needs sufficient time. Pay careful attention to physical space, and finally consider the issue of confidentiality. And you know, I'm guilty of this because I do work a lot, and I do have some friends that have a lot going on in their life. And you know, first and foremost, I haven't given enough time to have those types of conversations or phone calls or go out to lunch, and I need to make more time doing that. But you know, just be aware of, you know, taking the time to make a phone call. You know, maybe set up a lunch appointment. It's probably not going to do it at a Starbucks or a Panera or something like that, but you know, maybe meet them at their home or go for a walk, or you know, give them an opportunity. It doesn't have to be all day, right? Luther talks about, hey, you know, I have an hour at lunch. Do you want to go for a walk together, or do you want to talk about it? So kind of know that there's some set boundaries, but you know, we have an hour to walk together and talk as friends. I want to hear what's going on. I want to learn what's going on in your life, and see if there's anything that I can do to help. So I think just practically making sure that, I'm sure we all have somebody in our circle of influence that we might know might want to have a lunch or need some time. You know, take the time to do that, and consider the issue of confidentiality. I think that's
I think the physical space one and the confidentiality are probably him slipping back into presenting to pastors a little bit. I mean, you're probably not going to set up your living room just for the meeting with your friend, you know, or something like that. Whereas it could be a consideration that goes into how you set up an office or something like that. Though I would say it still is also, a lot of times these conversations will just start at coffee hour, right? And you're surrounded by people and the conversation is taking a turn. And that might be a good time to say, hey, why don't we just step into the other room real quick so I can give this my full attention, or something like that. You know, it can be okay to say, you know, I'm intentionally hitting pause to give this my focus right now. Go back to Lindsay's comment about parenting. Obviously, as parents, this happens a lot. What we thought was going to happen isn't what's happening now, and having the humility to redirect and say, all right, what I thought was going to happen might need to happen later because this is happening now, and that I think could be even like a space consideration, and then yeah, confidentiality. We're going to talk later about there are circumstances where I think it's the best support to say I can't keep this for your own good. I can't keep this entirely confidential. We'll talk about that a little bit later with some of the stuff. But I think for the most part, just reassuring somebody, hey, listen, I want you to feel free to talk to me. I'm not going to immediately turn around and tell my other friend or your spouse or, you know, somebody what it is you're feeling. If you're getting to the point where it's like, I feel like I need to talk to somebody else, ideally, you get the person's permission to say, hey, could we go together to somebody else? Or is it okay if I mention this to so-and-so? But that also can be really helpful, because certainly what becomes unhelpful is if somebody shares something deeply personal with you and then finds out that you've shared that with somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, that's going to cut that off pretty quickly and probably painfully. So.
And one of the other practical considerations that I always mess up with is my phone, especially after work. I'll have the phone out or something, and the kids will be like, you're on the phone 8 hours a day, get rid of the phone. And, you know, sometimes just having it out, you know, on a lunch appointment or something like that could cause a distraction for you, or the other person might think that, you know, you're not going to be engaged in the conversation, because what happens if the phone buzzes, you both look at it, and then you're sort of, you know, disengaged from the conversation. The same, go ahead.
Elijah, you were just telling us the other day, what was the stat about when the phone is out or something like that?
Yeah, it's like proven that people will talk less if you have a phone on at a dinner table. I'm really bad at this, I always have a phone.
Yeah.
But it's proven that people will like talk less and have less meaningful conversations even if they never check the phone,
Right.
it's just there.
Yeah.
Because you know they're thinking about it, it's just there.
Right, exactly, exactly. But that's a big thing, especially in these days and times. And same thing with the nonverbal communication. I think we understand this, you know, how to have engaged conversations. You know, think about the expressions that you're giving to the person. You know, think about how you're sitting, right? If you're kind of sitting back like this, or the phone or whatever it might be, sometime just engaging, with eye contact, or if they show an emotion, maybe you show an emotion, or at least just nodding that you're understanding and say, hey, keep going, let's keep talking about it. This is good information. Your body language might be just as important of the body language of the person that is talking to you, right? There's things that you can pick up from them in terms of nonverbal communication, if they're slouching or if they're, down like this and talking. And the same thing as the receiver of that information, you have to make sure that you're engaged, whether it's leaning in or, just the nodding, or, we'll talk about in a little bit paraphrasing and things like that. So these are all things that we kind of know in terms of the practical considerations of the nonverbal communication. I don't know if you have anything else or if anybody else does, but I think some of the other stuff in here is probably a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I do think it's just, when you're speaking with somebody, you can tell if they're engaged or if they're not engaged. And the people who will be sort of like, yeah, I'm listening. Sometimes I have a lot of conversations while we're, say, setting up the fellowship hall or something. So I will always try to say, I am listening, I'm putting this chair over there, or I'll say, is it okay if we walk together while we go, just ways to acknowledge that I'm trying to accomplish this other thing that maybe I shouldn't be trying to accomplish, but that I'm also trying to still enable and engage, because we've probably all had conversations where somebody's just kind of staring off in the middle distance, or they're doing something else, like, do I have your attention right now? And that I think can be a valuable consideration. That if you're doing something else, you're communicating that whatever this person is saying to you does not require my full attention, right? Or perhaps doesn't deserve my full attention. That's why the phone can become so tyrannical, because you would never interrupt. There are plenty of conversations we interrupt to check our phone that we would never interrupt if it were another human. If our child kept saying, Dad, 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 we'd say, stop saying that, but our phone keeps saying ding, 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 and we keep looking. So, that sort of thing too. Not to over-belabor. Hey, bud.
Okay, so let's get to these next two sections, because I think they're really important. Maybe some of the most important of the chapters of active listening and empathy. On the active listening side, active listening entails verbal behaviors by the listener that encourage the other person to continue talking, expand on topics, and explore deeper. And I think these are just some practical understanding things of what kind of information are we trying to get. Some of it's basic information, some of it's going to be expanding on the problem. So anybody have any thoughts on the value of closed questions versus open-ended questions or anything like that?
Would it be helpful if we did like a little definition of some of this stuff and then discuss? Or do people feel like these are terms and ideas you're already pretty familiar with?
So the closed question is like either a yes or no question or a simple answer, right? How many kids do you have? 2. How long have you been working there? 3. How long has this employer, or employee been bothering you? 2 years. An open-ended question is more something, I want to dig a little bit deeper, right? How does this emotion make you feel? Or, what is this person specifically doing to you that is causing this issue, right? We want to get to probably a deeper root and want to get more information, as opposed to a closed question that might have more of a finite answer. So, I think, in my opinion, if you're having some conversations like this, it will probably start with some closed questions, just trying to maybe get to know them a little bit, just their, in general, could be family life, could be the situation, and then as you start to peel back the onion more, as you ask some of these open-ended questions, most likely that's probably when the feelings or emotions or maybe the root cause or the root pain is going to come out. And it's just sort of figuring out when to place some of those or pepper some of those questions into the conversation. And then as you get those answers, practice this active listening and reflective listening. There's a difference between listening and active listening. Listening is, I could repeat back to you what you just said to me. Active listening is, I could repeat that back to you and in some way, shape, or form either paraphrase it, ask another question that follows up that, hey, I understand that, tell me a little bit more about it. And active listening is the biggest thing here, in addition to empathy, is just making sure they understand I hear you, I'm acknowledging it. I may not understand everything, but I want to learn more about it, and I'm going to ask you some more questions, or I'm going to confirm my understanding by paraphrasing or summarizing something.
Yeah, I think it can be helpful the way you broke it up, at least in my mind, the reflective listening / verbal mirroring, then the paraphrasing, then the summarizing. It's sort of, those are increasing levels of editorializing. So if somebody says, you know, a friend says to you, man, I am so stressed. And if you say, you're stressed, you literally just repeated the words. I mean, and it can seem very wooden, it can seem very awkward, but it's actually an incredibly great tool, especially if you don't have a lot of track record of kind of this deeper level conversation, because you haven't put any words in their mouth. You've just indicated, I've heard what you've said, but it's a very wide open door to explore it further. So the person could say, yeah, I'm stressed because this, this, and this, or they could say, yeah, I'm stressed, I can't eat, I can't, you know, they could talk about the stress, they could talk about the stressor, or they could just move on to a different topic. But at least it says I'm listening, I'm here, and I'm engaged. So, and I think I also think this isn't really what he's getting at, but I think it's the more tense a conversation is, the more helpful this becomes, the more potentially conflicted a conversation, because if emotions are heightened and you start trying to paraphrase or summarize, that might right away rankle. That might be annoying, to say the least. If, no, you're not listening to me, that's not what I said. You know, and that's the value of something like verbal mirroring, where it literally is just repeating what you've just heard as a way to sort of open the door for them to continue to express. Ratcheting that up a little bit would then be to paraphrase. So, and that paraphrasing can be a statement, or it could be get more into like an open-ended question, but if we stuck with that one, if a friend said to you, I'm really stressed, paraphrasing would say, you know, sounds like you've got a lot going on right now, or something like that. It's not the same words, maybe that's not even a perfect example, because that might be more along the lines of summarizing, but it could be, you know, you're stressed, sounds like your anxiety level's high, or something. You know, see if you can reword it a little bit differently, and if that gives them the green light to then go ahead and explore it a little bit more. Like I said, if you only ever do that, it would be frustrating because it would feel like you're not listening. But if you only ever just repeated the words that somebody said, that would also start to get a little bit annoying as well. There's it was a scene, I don't remember the movie or something, but it was somebody meeting with a psychologist, and the psychologist would just repeat, you know, they'd say, I'm stressed, you're quite stressed. Well, yeah, I've got a lot going on at work. You've got a lot going on at work. You know, you're repeating everything I say, that really bothers me. You're bothered because I'm repeating everything. It could get comical fast. Right. It's really just, what's the best way to help the person to open up?
I was going to say, the word that comes to mind as you're describing these scenarios is discernment. You have to determine from the interaction, maybe body language, it may be something someone says, how involved you need to get. And that discernment is critical in moving that conversation forward. I've learned over the years that I was asking a lot of closed questions in general, just in conversation. And I have kind of, gotten really good at asking open-ended questions now, because I want to learn more. I don't want a yes or no answer. It's like, well, you could say, for example, I don't know, how was your weekend? That's an open-ended question, and they can give you information about it. Or, if you ask a specific question that requires a yes or no, you don't really get anything. And you short-circuit the conversation. So in the matter of somebody in an emotional state, if someone says, I'm stressed, well, you could say, well, you're stressed, or you could say, well, what's happening?
Right.
Simply, what's happening?
Yep.
And they can either share, or they cannot share.
Yep.
And then you would discern whether or not it requires further interaction on your part, or just an ear to listen. And so discernment to me is like key, no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking it could be de-escalation with kindness and presence to get to a stable base, that then you can start to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Early on, when Don and I were married, we were learning how to communicate with each other. We bought a book, and particularly if you had a disagreement. And the takeaway from that book was just say, tell me more. And keep saying that a few times, tell me more. Because inevitably, you get to a deeper level of understanding about what that person is frustrated about, or what's bothering that person. And that's open-ended, tell me more. We found that very powerful, because most people listen on the surface level for an answer, And once you get that answer, then they move on to the next topic. And they don't peel the onion to really get to, what the frustration is or what the emotion is or something of that nature. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to come up with some brilliant question to ask.
Yeah.
It's just tell me more, tell me more. And it almost brings an emotional situation. It brings it down to where there's more logic involved in it instead of emotion. Because a lot of times when somebody's upset about something, the emotion squeezes the logic out of the situation, and it's emotion. And if you can give that kind of an active response, then it brings that emotion and that logic back down to where you can really understand what somebody is saying and maybe get to a deeper level of understanding about what their frustrations are.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts before, actually, this is along the same line. So would somebody be willing to read the empathy section?
Empathy means understanding and accepting how a person thinks and feels with no judgment or evaluation of his or her thoughts and feelings. It is not feeling what the speaker is feeling, that is sympathy. It is not agreeing with what the speaker is thinking, which may be impossible and unwise. Empathy encourages people to realize their emotions or thoughts, while unpleasant, distressing, and confusing are understandable.
Yeah, thank you. I think I wrote down in my notes that, I think this statement is really the heart of what Luther's talking about in this chapter, right? We aren't God. We don't have all the answers. Part of our job here is as Christians, as the epistle said today that Katya also read was, bear one another's burdens, right? Be there for one another, be empathetic in your listening. And sometimes that in itself can be, very powerful. And I'm sure there's instances in your lives where you've had people that have, listened with empathy and, that's gone a long way.
Anybody know how the proverb ends? A burden shared is a burden, you ever heard this? A burden shared is a burden halved, like cut in half. Yeah. So sometimes that's all it is. And I love that he's very clear. You don't have to agree with it, and if you don't, there will be opportunities to do that. Don't lead with that. But empathy is just really trying to understand what the world looks like from that person's standpoint. What they're experiencing and what it's like to be them, at least in a specific regard. So empathy is really, that's why sympathy means to feel with, and empathy means to enter into feeling. So you don't have to feel what someone else feels to enter into what they're feeling. Now, of course, they have to trust you enough to open up, which means you have to be trustworthy enough to be opened up to. But that's the idea with empathy, is to recognize that no matter how erratic someone's behavior might look to me, or how difficult it is to interpret, from where they sit, it makes sense. Or at least from where they sit, there's some continuity to it. That even if they say, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, then you can empathize with that, because that would also be a feeling of a loss of control or a feeling of frustration with oneself and one's own decision making, but you can enter into those things. So it's just trying to see the world, or particularly if it's more specific, this situation, whatever it is, through that person's eyes. What does it look like to them? What does it feel like, if they're willing to share, to be them? I don't have to feel the same things to then hopefully be able to empathize with what they're feeling. And depending on the nature of the relationship, if coming to a shared understanding is important, well then that empathy, if it can be going both directions, is really helpful, because that way I can be honest about what I'm feeling, the other person can be honest about what they're feeling. They don't have to be the same feelings for me to try to respect what they're feeling and even try to draw insight from that, and hopefully that is reciprocated. So empathy is a pretty big idea that sometimes is used a little glibly, but I think is a really a wonderful thing. And by the way, pausing long enough, what is our great theological example of empathy? What did Jesus do? Yeah. Right? He left heaven and took on our own nature. What is that if not feeling what, entering into what human feeling and human experience is? And though he was in the very nature God, he emptied it, so obviously the incarnation, the incarnal truth of what we believe, Christ has set us the prime example for this. He did not become sinful, though, in learning how to empathize with humans, so we don't have to enter into the actual behavior or even the actual feeling. in order to try to understand what the world's like from from where they sit right now.
Any other comments before we get into some of the behaviors that derail a helpful conversation? Okay, I'm going to read a couple things here from the book, just sort of defining what Luther's talking about here. You know, interrupting is pretty self-explanatory. He says interrupting is bad manners in any conversation, but it's antithetical to a helpful conversation. It indicates impatience, disinterest, desire to dominate the conversation, and perhaps a general lack of understanding of the speaker's pain. Same thing with why questions. Why did you feel like that? Or why did you do that? I think sometimes how you sort of come across or state that question could be a little bit different, or, tell me why you feel that way is okay. But if you just come out and say, why did you feel like that? Or why did that bother you? It could be a little bit dismissive or make them feel defensive. Quick reassurance or quick advice. Lindsay will tell you that this is my number one transgression. My number one statement is don't worry about it. It's gonna be fine. Because I don't worry. I don't worry to a fault, probably, Lindsay will tell you. And I can obviously see how that can be sort of deflating in the sense that, all right, well, what I'm saying isn't really that valuable. If nobody's worrying about it, then maybe I shouldn't worry about it, or maybe it's not a big deal, or maybe it doesn't matter to this person. Quick reassurance communicates to that person that what he's concerned about is trivial, right? Same thing with quick advice. If they're telling you something and you interject and you say, well, this is why, or this is how you should do it, you're sort of just cutting off that open flow of communication, which could really stunt the conversation. And then the insistence of disclosure, the conversation might come to a topic where it's now too uncomfortable for someone to talk about and how we can handle that. But we'll get to that in a minute. Any thoughts on, any some of these behaviors that can derail a helpful conversation?
It'd be fun if we had a vote who's guilty of the most, which one's yours, but I think that would probably be more disclosure than you're wanting to do, and I'm not supposed to insist on it, so.
Well, I disclosed on behalf
Yeah,
of all
yeah.
of you. Don't worry about anything, it'll be fine.
All of the above, yeah. The one thing I would say, and Jason covered this well, so I'm not sure I 100% agree with Saunders, the author here, because he says why questions are bad. Some why questions are bad, because some why questions will inevitably put the person in a defensive stance. Why'd you do that? And now they're feeling like they have to defend what they did. But if somebody was saying, this happened and I felt really sad, and you said, well, why do you think that made you feel sad? That can be totally valid as long as it's not. And here's where you could even just say, if it doesn't, I think I understand why, there are plenty of reasons why you might feel sad, but why do you think that was your response here? So at least you validate the response. They're not feeling like, oh, now he thinks this is a weird thing and I need to defend it or something like that. When he says why questions derail a helpful conversation, the wrong kind of why questions do. The right kind can be the kind of open-ended questions that can really help people to continue to dig. But I think a lot of it's, help me to understand what you're thinking, not defend your thinking to me. If we stance it that way, I think that gets where we want to go.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about some of these things, and Pastor, I might lean on you a little bit more with some of the latter sections, but let's talk about families, right? The individual that is anxious might be one piece of the puzzle, like Lindsay was talking about. We have things that cause anxiety, and we want to make sure we're there for our children. Or like I said, friends around me that currently are dealing with anxiety or loss. Think about the family members in these situations. What burdens are they bearing? What can we be mindful of here? Keep the one in mind who is taking care of that person with distress. They could feel taxing, or they could feel angry that they can't help the situation, or maybe they haven't helped enough, or maybe it's starting to affect their faith a little bit. Maybe they're angry at God. And what scripture can we point to help them understand that, hey, God works for the good of those who love him, right? And he's not going to give you anything more than you can bear. Coming up with scripture that can give them some comfort in knowing that, hey, yes, this stinks, but that doesn't mean that God has forgotten about you, or that God is not with you in this distress, and He's does give you tools. Prayer being a big one. One of the meditations I was reading the other day is just, don't forget about the importance of prayer, right? You just sit here and pray right now to God and have a conversation. It doesn't have to be something formal. It doesn't have to be something. You can be mad. Think about Job. How mad was he at God, right? But you pray and see what could come from that. So keep the families in mind that, could be going through this distress as well, either just pain that they're sharing with this person or maybe some frustration in the situation that they can't control. And then, do you want to talk a little bit about the courtesy stigma side of it?
Oh, yeah, so courtesy stigma is, I hadn't seen that particular phrase before, but the idea is that if there's a stigma to something that a family member is dealing with, then sometimes it's sort of like a secondhand smoke, it's sort of, then there's a stigma to the whole family. Why isn't your family good enough to take care of this? Or if it's, somebody's spouse is dealing with something, there can be sort of, and I think sometimes there was a neat example that he used, but like if somebody that at church comes in on crutches, you'd ask what happened and what are they doing to treat it and how do you feel? Does it hurt very much? But if that same person came in and had said, I think I'm dealing with a major depressive episode, we probably would react very differently, and not necessarily, obviously you don't want to dive right in and make somebody bare their soul, that whole requiring disclosure or that sort of thing, but can you respond by just saying, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that, have been able to see anybody, is there any kind of treatment, are you finding things that are helpful or that are harmful? A lot of it's like you were pointing out, just not reacting with surprise. But I think a lot of times out of maybe politeness, people aren't quite sure what to say, so they don't say anything, which kind of shuts down the conversation and unintentionally sends the message, I don't want to deal with this. And it could just be, I'm not sure how to deal with this, but I'd say, well, deal with it the way you would if somebody's leg had an issue, Does that hurt a lot? Are you finding it's really affecting the way you can function, or is it certain times? Or, just with kind of an openness and a curiosity, let them set the pace.
Right.
But I think that would be a great thing. I think that also goes into, we don't have to talk a lot about church-wide strategies. A lot of it's because they're like, well, you should have classes about mental health and situations where people can talk about it and stuff. It's like, yeah, that's what we're doing. So, which is great, very, very reassuring, because the reality is we saw the stats in a couple of the chapters, but as Lindsay pointed out, we're all affected by this in some way. We've all got our own challenges, whether they would rise to the level of a statistical diagnosis or not. We're all bearing our own burdens and our own challenges. Expand that out to our friends and our loved ones and our coworkers and our family members, and it's affecting everybody. So it's really something that I hope, as a church, certainly all of us as individuals, can try to just be as open and supportive about. And so that's one of the great blessings. We talked about this at Elders, but the number of people who've been willing in these conversations to say, yeah, I'm dealing with this, or a loved one dealing with that. And you just start to realize how widespread it is. It's all of us, whether it's firsthand or secondhand. And that's great. The less boundary there is or hurdle there is to trying to discuss, the more you can helpfully discuss. And be able to bear one another's burdens. How about that timing with that coming up this week? And the do not be anxious about anything. I'm like, yeah, God knew.
Yeah.
Do you want me to cover some of the chapter 10 stuff? And I'll try to do it pretty quickly, since that gets some of the heavy
that's
lifting.
fine. Yeah.
So this does start to get into some of the stuff that I think is geared more toward pastors, but it's good for everybody to be aware of. In fact, I was even thinking, they provided it at the library. It was called a mental health first aid program. So it's just sort of the way when you take first aid, you're not becoming an ER surgeon. You're not becoming a trauma doctor. You're just being aware of what are some of the circumstances that are likely to occur when you're out and about in regular life. And it all says, put pressure on it with a clean wrapping until the pros get there. Right? That's what all first aid basically is. Remember, Elijah, when we were joking, like everything in Boy Scouts was put ointment on it or wait for the professionals. That was all of it. That was the whole first aid thing, right? So that I actually thought we could even look into whether we wanted to offer something like that here, like a mental health first aid thing. But this is the kind of stuff it would touch on. So mental health lies on a continuum. Serious problems require a referral. So that makes sense. And he talked about that earlier. It's not that you're either mentally healthy or mentally sick. But it's all on a continuum, and that's why I liked the question, just, is this a problem from which you could, help would be helpful, you know, where some in sort of assistance might be needed. Indicators of severity, I think this is helpful to sort of differentiate between what we would call just the stresses and strains of everyday life versus something that might be rising to the level of needing more professional input, whether that's going to require, you know, medical intervention, which can have its own stigma, which it really shouldn't but does, or, you know, therapy or various different approaches, but sudden and substantial changes. So somebody that you know and love is just seeming like a totally different person all of a sudden, and it's not just a day or a couple of days, but this is kind of major. That's a time that it might be worth finding the right setting and the right time to say, hey, is something going on? You know, it seems like something might be going on. But it mentions here, and I'm glad it does, emotional distress related to a recent and severe trauma. If something has happened, like Gary, you were very open with sharing about when Linda died, and that was completely out of the blue and everything. So yes, that's going to redefine your reality for a while is very normal and very hard. You know, so there's a difference between if let's say a child is all of a sudden, you know, usually very outgoing, now all of a sudden very quiet, usually loves to go out and do things, now only wants to stay home, you know, and you're not aware of anything that happened, then that's a good time to say, hey, what's going on? And maybe it's just, you know, life development, or maybe something's happened. But on the flip side, if you know that, say, that child has just moved here from the West Coast, you don't want to put on them the burden of, I think you might have a mental health problem. It's like, no, they're dealing with a lot. They just moved. You can validate that. But the intensity of the distress is something that really becomes life-defining. Similarly, the duration of the problem. And here, I don't like the idea that there's any particular target time. So when I talk about it with people, I usually try to use a rage like ad absurdum. You know, literally say, you know, if some major life event just happened and 20 minutes later you're saying, I'm totally fine with this, I'm thinking you're probably not totally fine with this. But if 15 years later, this is the only thing you can think about, the only thing, okay, we probably should talk about why that is. Somewhere in between the 20 minutes and the 15 years, life ought to be able to start to become integrated. And if it's starting to seem longer and longer and the person is unable to feel like they're making progression, that might be time to also talk about, hey, maybe we need a little more help than what we've got right now. So anyway, those are all just things to kind of keep in mind. Again, I think this is geared more toward pastors or counselors specifically, but they're things, consider it mental health first aid. Be aware of this in the people you're interacting with, your family members, and yourself. Suicidal ideation and intent and domestic abuse. We kind of have to touch on them, but they're huge topics and they're very, very personal topics. So I'm just going to present a tiny bit, and if people want to talk more about it, I'm happy to set up a time. But I agree with everything that's quoted here. Most persons think about their own deaths at times. Thinking about suicide is much more serious, especially if it's the result of emotional distress. And then anyone expressing suicidal intent should be, it says taken, I would say referred for immediate care. It's not like you're necessarily literally hopping in the ambulance. But and that is kind of the continuum. To think about your own death is natural. To sometimes be longing for that. I mean, we're told to live as Christ, to die as gain. So especially as Christians, you know, that, I don't know if a mental health professional would say, well, Paul's suicidal. Well, I'm not reading it that way. We just understand we've got something better awaiting. So it's okay to every once in a while say, you know what, I'm ready for this part to be done. I'm ready for the next chapter where it's all Jesus, right? However, there is a difference then between starting to think about suicide in terms of desiring it, and where they say the real line gets crossed is if people have started to think about the question of how. If somebody has started to think about, well, I could do it, I could do this, or I could do that, that's probably time to go get some help, because you don't want, every plan you make makes the steps a little easier, so you just don't, that's where there might be a little more need for support. However, I think it's also helpful to normalize and recognize even suicidal ideation is a very common experience. So it's not like you're a hopeless cause because you've already gotten to this point. That's why I don't even like the wording of taken for immediate care, because it sounds to me like, you know, lock them away, they're too far gone now, and that's not the case. What you are trying to do is try to make sure they're kept safe until whatever this is can start to be addressed in a healthy way that's not going to end their life or put them at undue risk, and supporting from that standpoint. Similarly, with domestic abuse, obviously is very frontal with even labeling the whole section. Domestic abuse must be referred. defines it as intentional acts of violence, threats, and control done by one person to another, and I would add within a home situation. That's the domestic part of this. One person to another to intimidate and control the other person. Situations of domestic abuse are fraught with danger and risk, and the overarching concern is safety. The reason that Saunders, and you can read the section, the reason that Saunders is so stark about this is any attempts to intervene and assist could exacerbate the situation rather than helping. Imagine as a police officer, you probably get a lot of, do you want to throw anything in here?
After, whenever we have a domestic violence call, we ended with a screening and asking questions about the history, because usually by the time you're involved, there's been multiple situations, and it's the most deadly event for usually females, but males as well.
Yeah.
Because especially after we get involved in court, and the victims sometimes feel reluctant, and they want to take it all back, and then they take the person back, even though they haven't made any improvements. It is the most dangerous situation.
It's
that we
tough.
encounter.
Yeah, and so I think that's why it's good. I would defer to a police officer because I know there's lots of training, because those are so fraught. If anytime something wanders toward domestic violence, I'll ask somebody, are you safe, et cetera. And if the answer were to be no, which hasn't happened yet in any of the conversations I've had, that would be time to get other professionals involved, because, God forbid that out of your intent to try to empathize and try to support, you make the situation riskier. You put the person at risk of more harm. Even advice, well-intended advice, Now, but at the same time, and I'm not really sure, so just pray for wisdom if the circumstance arises, you also don't want to all of a sudden treat that person like they're a third rail and I can't have any conversations with you or anything. You say, I'll be praying for you, I'll be here for you any way that I can, but I really think we should reach out. If you want me to go with you, I'll go with you. I really think we should be trying to find some more support for how do we go about, and also depends on the situation, because most of the time where there's domestic abuse, the victim is in some way dependent on the abuser. And so just getting them out of that situation is not necessarily great, because how are they going to be provided for at this point, et cetera. So it gets very complicated very quickly, and that's where you don't want your goodwill to create worse scenarios. So that's where it's, as soon as the person is willing and ready, try to bring in other professional support. That's why there are completely anonymous hotlines and that sort of thing, so that they can try to help walk people through. But it doesn't mean you can't be a friend. It doesn't mean that you can't pray. It doesn't mean that you can't try to support empathetically. What are you feeling, et cetera. I think it is the danger, probably for all of us, not just the fixers in the room, although I know there's a lot of fixers in the room just by personality. But that's where it would be like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to, careful, because that might seem really good today, and tomorrow that might turn out to have been really bad. So, and then the discernment when seeking a mental health provider. This is actually really worthwhile. I talk with people about this a lot. So, seek only licensed mental health professionals. Be aware somebody can call themselves a counselor and not have any training whatsoever, especially if they get into language like life coach or that sort of thing. I mean, I'm not saying that person might not be able to give you good advice, but it's worth finding out, do they have any training whatsoever in this? Because if not, it'd probably be better if you went to somebody who did. I'll talk about a practical way with this, but seeking someone with relevant competence. There's a lot of different aspects of mental health. There's more research being done all the time. There are lots of different interventions, both therapy techniques and pharmacological options. You want somebody that is well versed in this. Obviously, every provider needs to gain experience, but you don't want to be somebody's first case of something. So you want somebody who's at least being mentored by someone with a little more. Seek someone who explicitly recognizes the importance of religious beliefs. He doesn't specifically say that you need to seek someone who's Christian. In fact, let me pair this with the next one. If someone insists on, this is an interesting way to phrase this, if someone insists on seeing a Christian counselor, be sure that she, referring to the counselor, he or she, willing to state that she or she asks about her client's faith, is respectful of that faith, and will refer back to her client's pastor in issues of faith. Interestingly enough, I've said it with people before, I think I've even said it in this class, I don't really, other than for the sake of his own soul, I don't really care what my cardiologist believes. As long as he's good at taking care of hearts. Now that's not quite as true with mental health, because it does reflect a worldview. You want someone who understands the importance of spiritual and religious life. You don't want someone who believes who's a full bore, what they would call a materialist, who doesn't believe that there's a supernatural realm, doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe, and is going to urge you away from that. But the danger of saying, I want to see a Christian counselor is, as we know, there are a lot of different understandings of Christianity, and unfortunately, some of them will say you just need to pray more, you just need to trust God more, this is just you not trusting God, or that sort of thing, which is just so burdensome and so unhelpful. So interestingly enough, Saunders, who is a Christian and is a mental health provider, says if you insist on seeing a Christian counselor, which is kind of funny because that's what he is, then make sure that they're going to defer to the pastor for the pastoral care and are going to respect the differences between the way that we approach faith. I'd say that's true of a Christian counselor, it's true of a non-Christian counselor. I think it's great if somebody is coming at it themselves as a person of faith, but I don't think that's a deal breaker if they're not. The same way I don't think it's a deal breaker with my cardiologist, whether he's a person of faith or not. There is, I said I would say practically, psychologytoday.com. Psychology Today is just a magazine/journal. They maintain a very robust database of providers. So you can search and then you can sort it by if you'd rather you were being treated by a male or by a female, if faith-based matters, and you can click what type of is this trauma specific, is it something else, some sort of addiction recovery or whatever, the different types of treatment. So you can really sort that database. Do they accept insurance? Do they not accept insurance? But what I will say, and then it's 12:35, and I appreciate your patience. Shopping around for a counselor is both very, very hard and I believe very, very crucial. So I try to gear people up if I'm advising them to try to get more support for whatever their circumstance is. Be ready that you might need to go to 2 or 3 or more different counselors before you find somebody who's the right fit. The same way that you're well aware, sometimes you need to start taking a medication, but this one doesn't agree well with your system. You need to switch to that one. That doesn't mean you're a problem. It just means that medication is not the right solution. Take the same approach if you ever do need to seek out counseling. And one of the things that I encourage people to at some point, try to essentially expect from their counselors, how long do you think I should be working on this? Because some counselors are happy to enter into a relationship where they're just going to be the person you talk to for an hour a week for the rest of your life. And I would think in a healthy support network, you hopefully don't need a professional counselor an hour a week for the rest of your life. Hopefully they're going to start to teach you tools. They might wish to bring in some of your immediate family members or something so you can understand how to build these into your life. But I like the counselors that are trying to work themselves out of a job. A dentist who said that he wanted to fill a cavity every week for the rest of your life is probably not the right dentist to go and see. But with counseling, a lot of times that might be the approach. And unless you're lacking the support network to provide that care and empathy in your life, in which case, get it. And if that's through a counselor, great. But I think understanding how would you recommend that we're going to approach this? What are the outcomes you're desiring? And it's not just saying I want to stuff this in the closet, to say, well, how soon do we think we might be able to see some movement on this? What would the goal be? And that can be a great way to evaluate the person that you're working with. So anyway, that was a lot of me talking, but I thought that might, and maybe not, but it might have been the fastest way to get through it. Any questions with all of that? Like I said, some of those questions, if you want to explore them, are probably better offline than online, literally. But anything that somebody wanted to point out with the last bit, helping versus referring? Anyone thinks they say? Yeah, the next.
Just brought back to college, that we had something at our college called the helpline that I was involved in. It was an anonymous phone that
Yep.
people could, so yeah, it's in the 80s, they had, people, kids that were in college could call, and we actually we all went through active listening training.
Mhm.
We all had, it was at a Christian college,
Yep.
we had a list of police and different people who we could refer to if they needed to, but it was all active listening. We had a little sheet that we could
Yep.
write notes on and stuff, and we could also end with, we would try to do at the end, we have it all
Mhm.
there. But the tried and true.
Yep.
They're good things, and we get calls when people serve till like 2 in the morning or something, whatever the time was, especially on weekends or something. And, anonymous phone call, we didn't know their name, they didn't know our name. We were actually, the office was in a room underneath the church.
Interesting. Well, that's cool. Well, there are lots of resources like this as well, and I think, it's the cliche. I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but either you need the support of a friend, or you're the friend that someone needs your support, right? Something along those lines, right? So, and I think a lot of them are happening at the same time too. So, I think the more we can be aware of what the challenges are, the more that we're just not intimidated and freeze up, if somebody is in that situation, and the more we can be aware of some of the steps that might help someone to open up. That's great. You're not becoming their counselor. You're not curing them or solving their problems or any of those things. You're just a support. And that's what we're called to do, bear one another's burdens. So why don't I close us up with a word of prayer. Jason, thank you so much for leading us and on short notice. And thank you to all the elders over the course of the summer. And before I pray, real quickly, so next week, obviously, we're not studying this book anymore. We're not looping it back. I'm going to do another Ask Anything class. The first portion of it, if you've got questions, send them in. The first portion will be all the questions the Sunday school came up with over the last year. So I'll have them come join us. That's always super fun. I'm hoping there's at least some unicorns and some dinosaurs involved. There usually are. And then, so we'll start with the kiddos' questions, and then happy to go into any other questions. And part of what we'll do next week then is come to a conclusion together what we'd like to study next. Normally in the fall we would jump into some book of the Old Testament, head toward a book of the New Testament in the winter, and then in the spring do something from the Confessions. That's what we have typically kind of slid into, but that's not dictated from anywhere. So you can give that some thought over the next week too. What might you like to study, particularly maybe in the Old Testament realm, but not necessary. So yeah, but for next week, if you know any now, I can start writing them down now, or you can email them in. You're allowed to throw them out on the cuff, but you never know how off the hook I might get with the answer. So, but any questions next week, if we need to extend that, we've done that before. But all right, let's say a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this time together in worship and in conversation. And though the time has gotten late, we pray that the time has been used by you in guiding us and helping us to empathize and helping us to understand, helping us to recognize our own challenges are not things that separate us from you, nor are they things that you cannot help with. And the challenges of those around us, we might be able to be used by you in helping to minister to those. Help us to trust you in all these things. Thank you for Jason helping to lead the other elders over the course of the summer. Thank you for each person here. Pray that as we go forth from this place, you'd go with us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, thanks so much. Thank you, sir.